over to Catherine now, is that
Yes,
right?
that's right,
Okay.
yes. I just wanted to pick up on something Lolita said before we move on about terminology as well, and that's something we cover in our workshops, the use of, you know, terminology and acronyms, workplace acronyms or everyday ones we use. And yeah, we all know that this can be quite exclusive kind of language if you're not aware of them. Okay, so moving on. In part 2, we're going to look at recognizing when communication is challenging, online conversations and phone calls, and small talk and humor. So like Zan said with the first part, it's really just a snapshot of, you know, a few strategies that come up in our books and our training. So recognizing when communication is challenging. Well, I thought we'd share some photos just to sort of remind ourselves of those situations, those contexts that could be quite difficult for our communication partners, whether they're operating in another language or they're neurodivergent. So for example, in the first picture, we've got a social setting here. So there may be multiple people talking at the same time, which can be difficult. A lot of small talk, which I'll come on to in a minute, maybe background noise. The second one, again, background noise, taking a call outside. The third one, perhaps we can all relate to some extent from the last 18 months of working from home and the added distractions there, whether it's family members, pets, or other things happening in the background. Again, number 4, also COVID related, the wearing of masks, of course, that kind of muffles our voice, but also takes away the visual clues of being able to see someone's face when you're communicating. And then the final one of open plan working. So open plan offices, where you may be having a lot of ambient noise, maybe colleagues having conversations next to you. And while all of these are distracting for most of us, if you're autistic or if you're operating in another language, this really adds to the difficulty in understanding and then adds to stress. And I think it's important to point out something we would all recognize, but it's easy to forget, that when your stress levels are higher, your ability to understand and communicate really suffers. Especially, I mean, I speak in other languages, and if I feel stressed in a stressful situation, my ability to communicate clearly really drops. So it's all about creating a good environment to communicate with people. So if we have a look at online conversations and phone calls, we chose this because obviously it's very poignant at the moment with a lot of business and work being virtual still. And for both books, for our international colleagues and clients, and also for neurodivergent colleagues and clients, there was a real consensus that phone calls were a real area of difficulty, a real challenging area, and that most people avoided phone calls if they could. And also the difficulties of online conversations, although there were, especially for autistic people, some advantages to that. So let's have a look at some of the reasons why this is challenging. So the first two here are perhaps obvious: technical glitches and no visual clues. So, you know, this can be distracting for everybody, but imagine if you're operating in a second or third language and there are technical glitches and you're losing the odd word and there's disruptions to the line. Whereas if it's your own language, you can probably easily fill in the gaps or pick up where the conversation is left. But when you're operating in another language, this is really difficult to do. And again, if you're on the phone or if you're in an online conversation without video, then the lack of visual clues really can add another layer of difficulty as well. Oops, sorry. Added to this is unpredictability, and this is particularly the case for phone calls, and why a lot of people find these difficult is the timing. You know, if you don't know somebody's going to phone you and you receive a call out of the blue, this can be a really difficult thing to suddenly have to shift your focus from what you were doing. A lot of our autistic readers said this was a particular issue, this shift in focus. And also for speakers of other languages, it's suddenly having to choose, you know, they may have been operating in their own language when they received the calls, they're having to change language, but also to rapidly try and understand the topic of the call and be able to respond appropriately. Which brings us on to context. If the context of the conversation isn't clear, then this also adds to the person's anxiety because they're having to quickly guess what the person is talking about. And I think this is particularly true when you phone somebody, you know in your head the purpose of the call and what you want to communicate. And so you're actually expecting the person who picks up the phone to very quickly fill in the gaps and gather what you're wanting to talk about. It's also harder to contribute. So obviously if you're face to face, you can rely on body language and tone of voice to show that people want to contribute. When you're online, this is much harder to do. And especially we've all been in situations in online meetings where more dominant personalities also dominate the conversation. And distractions, like we said in those, you know, as we're raised in those photos, there are often more distractions around you, which can add to difficulties. So what can we do to help our communication partners? Well, one thing we can do is to email or text in advance and offer follow-up. So, for example, in the case of phone calls, it's really useful if you can just text or email the person in advance and say, is it okay if I call you now? Or can I call you at 11 o'clock? And tell them what you want to speak about so that they know in advance that you're going to call and they know the subject. And this takes away a lot of anxiety and stress. And also to offer a follow-up so that if you are speaking on the phone, knowing that this is going to be a more challenging communication for a lot of people, then at the end of the call to offer to text or email with a little summary of what you've discussed can really help. As Sam said earlier, pause between different points and ideas. I think if anything, we probably go even faster when we're on the phone or in online discussions. So remember, in our workshops, we say a lot about the importance of pausing, giving people time to process what you're saying, and maybe having some quiet time in online meetings where people can just reflect and gather their thoughts before contributing. And check understanding. So what we do say, though, is to avoid the question, do you understand? Because invariably, if you ask people, do you understand? They'll say yes, regardless of the reality. So how can you check understanding? Well, I think, as it was mentioned in the first point, if you offer a follow-up email or text, you can summarize the main points. And I think at the end of any call, to do a bit of a roundup of the information you've discussed and the main action points can help with this. And in groups, you can agree how to interrupt and, if possible, delegate a chair to manage the call. We always advise that it's good to actually acknowledge the fact that communication can be challenging. And so it's at the beginning of a meeting, it's a really nice idea to just say, okay, we realize that online conversations can be difficult. So please tell me in the chat box if I'm going too fast. And if you want to speak, you know, raise the hand icon, but make it very explicit at the beginning of how people can contribute, and this will give them more opportunity to. And if possible, delegate a chair to manage the call, or somebody in the group who just monitors participation, and so they can notice if somebody is not contributing and then invite them in with direct questions. Oops, sorry. And the last one, offer breaks when necessary. So I think we've all suffered Zoom fatigue, but if you're neurodivergent or operating in a second language, these can be doubly exhausting. So it's really important to offer breaks where necessary. And I think in terms of checking understanding, if you're working with international colleagues and clients, regular breaks can also give them an opportunity to check their understanding with their co-workers who speak the same language. So last little point in this presentation is small talk and humour. So we picked this out again because it's such a big topic for both our autistic readers and the international clients and colleagues. So I think unanimously people said that they found small talk the most difficult part of communicating. And I think the reason we want to include it as well is it's something that perhaps we're not aware of being difficult for people. Because when do we use small talk and humour? Well, we use it to break the ice, to bond with colleagues, to make people feel at ease. And so it's really important to be aware that actually the opposite effect can often be true, that your small talk and humour could be making your communication partner feel very anxious and excluded from the conversation. So here are 3 examples of how it can be exclusive. So the first one here beautiful weather today, isn't it? So typical British day in the rain there. And also a typical kind of British statement, isn't it? It's this use of sarcasm, saying the opposite of what is true. And unfortunately, culturally, sarcasm may not be familiar and so understood. And also it's back to this idea of things being understood literally. And so if you're understanding this literally, then it can be confusing, and it may unsettle you and make you unsure what to do or how to respond. The second example, the match last night had me on the edge of my seat. So often sport is a subject to small talk, isn't it? So the difficulty here is the use of figurative language, like Zan was commenting earlier on idioms. So had me on the edge of my seat. So somebody might be picturing this edge of a seat and really not understand the figurative meaning here. And also it's very typical in small talk that we make these statements. And this also leaves your communication partner really not knowing, how do I respond to that? It's not a question, so how can I respond? And then the third one, did you see the Blue Planet series? David Attenborough is great, isn't he? So the third one is cultural references. So with your international colleagues and clients, be careful of the cultural references you use, because we do throw them in all the time. And while they might be household names for a lot of people, there will be lots of people who don't relate to it. And we've had lots of our international business students saying that, you know, especially the chat in the pub or in the restaurant, in the cafe, the small talk is often about cultural references that they just can't participate with. So small talk can be baffling because it's off topic and often fast, usually full of idioms and figurative language, often intended to be humorous, even though that might not be received as humorous, sometimes culturally specific. Okay, so there's another aspect to this though, that's, as I said at the beginning, we use small talk to break the ice, to get a friendly atmosphere, bond with colleagues. But if it is an area of communication that people feel unable to participate in, this can make them feel quite isolated. And also if somebody's not joining in on these occasions, they can also be misunderstood as being unsociable or lacking interest or even aloof. And so it's really key to be aware of this and to be aware of the possible reasons why somebody isn't joining in. So this doesn't mean avoid small talk completely. It just means, more is less. So limit it, and also try to include people by asking them direct questions. So if there's a bit of banter about this match on TV last night, then try to ask some direct questions to people who aren't participating, maybe asking them if they watch sport or something about their personal interest. Okay, well, ready for our breakout discussion 2 now. So it's 2 questions here. The first one is, how did you keep lines of communication open with your colleagues, clients during COVID? And maybe a second part to that is, how successful was it? And then the second one is, what communication strategies from today did you find most useful or relevant, and why?
Well, I think I'd just like to very quickly go back to those answers that Afshan had when she asked those questions, what are your superpowers? And I thought that was really interesting, all those answers there. But what does stand out for me is, this is all about inclusive communication, but I think actually it's about empathy. It's about empathetic communication. It's just, being aware of our own language and doing what we can to help others who have more problems with communication, who tend to be the ones who do all the work, either those learning a second language or a neurodivergent person. So really all we're trying to do, Catherine and I, in our workshops and our books, is really just get people, flip that narrative and get people to think, what can they do? What can they do to make somebody else's life a little bit easier? So I think that's about it. But thank you so much for all your ideas. Could have talked for another hour.
I know. Absolutely. Well, and this is where the topics that, they sort of, one topic informs the next. So in a way, it's a continuation of a conversation. The next Inspire Forum will be in January. And I'm really thinking active listening and feedback could be something that could be a key topic here. It's coming through again and again from Monday and from this afternoon from this evening. So it gives us an opportunity to meet again and to carry on the conversations. So as I say, if you need to go, do not worry about it. I hope I can see in the chat that you have enjoyed it, so I'm very grateful. This is what this is all about, having that input and insight. Hang on for another 10 minutes if you want to. So just give you a moment if you need to go off and do stuff, please. Lovely to see you, and enjoy the rest of your evening.